Hi everyone. I'm going to walk through a basic tutorial of how I do my editing. This one is not perfect, so bear with me. But anyway, so the first thing I like to do is start with cleaning up any of the blemishes or imperfections either in the skin or in the background or in the hair. So first thing I do is I make a copy of the background layer so that anything that I do can be undone. And then right now I'm just going through with the spot healing brush and I'm just cleaning up any stray hairs that I might see, any texture that I see on this. I first start with texture and then I go and deal with color after I deal with just the little bits of cleaning up that need to be done. So you can see here that I'm starting with cleaning the excuse me, sorry. Just little tiny bits of maybe acne or inconsistencies on the skin that a client might be unhappy with. On the forehead there were little pieces of stray hair that I cleaned up. I feel like the spot healing brush is a really powerful tool for any of those little things that you want to clean up and just get rid of that may be distracting in your image. Sorry. For me, on some of my past images, I've gone a little too overboard with the skin. I want it to look realistic, like you're looking at a real person and not flat and rubbery. So I've kind of changed up my flow a little bit just to compensate for that. That way everything looks natural. Okay, so normally too I would clean up the skirt and heal some of those wrinkles and flaws in the skirt, but I'm not going to deal with that here just because I want to be able to show you the flow without this video taking an hour. So the next thing I deal with is the color, especially in the hands right here. You can see there are a lot of blues and grays. I have a lot of gray along the chin and fingers on this image because I underexposed it slightly. If you don't nail your exposure, at least what I have found is then I end up with some grays whenever I use strobes in the studio. So I'm using Cindy's Actions right now for this, but you can also just do a normal color balance layer and just do the opposite color of whatever it is you're trying to fix. The channel mixer and hue and saturation work really well too. I love using Cindy's color correcting, especially for the grays. I feel like the gray is just really powerful and it fixes it super easily rather than trying to do it on my own. So everything I'm gonna do here is mostly by hand, but you can also, everything that I'm doing you can also use Cindy's Actions for as well. I just wanted to show some things in case you don't have any actions, so you can see how to do it by hand. Right here I'm just cleaning up the chin and around the lip because there was some gray around the lip. So you can see it's really subtle, but it just warms up those shadows a little bit. So if you find, like I cleaned up the gray on the arm, but then when I turned it off and on I still saw some red from correcting that was not where I wanted it to be. So you can just invert your brush back to black and go and brush off wherever you don't want the gray to be. Alright, so now I'm going to start dealing with cleaning up the skin some more. This is where you want to be really subtle because if you go overboard, your skin is going to look really fake and flat and plastic. So I put a blank layer. I'm using my healing brush, and make sure you set it to sample current and below or all layers. When you're doing this, you're really just looking at the texture. Again, don't worry about the color. We'll fix that on later layers. So right there under the cheek, there was just a lot of uneven texture. You want to be consistently sampling areas that are close by, otherwise you'll get texture from the edge, like I did a few seconds ago, of whatever it is you're sampling. So just make sure you're constantly resampling. Sometimes you might have wrinkles or flaws around the lip, so I always check that area to clean up as well. In this case, there were some shadows and hair around the lip line, so I'm just cleaning up some of the texture from the shadows or wrinkles from if you've got someone that's a smoker or maybe they smile a lot. Especially as people age, they start to get lines around their lips, so just check for that. Okay, and so that's another thing. You really want to be sampling close to. If you sample an area that's too light and you try and go brush it on, it's going to leave a harsh white line. So make sure you're sampling areas that are close by so that they match the value and the texture. Okay, so then I'm going to do another layer. I'm going to use my clone stamp, and I have the flow set at 5%, so I keep it really low. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to clean up the under eye. So I'm sampling just below, just so I can kind of smooth the transition and really lighten that under eye, but do it in a way that's really subtle. You don't want to get rid of the under eye completely, or else it'll look really fake. And so this doesn't look like much now, but when I go turn it on and off, you'll see it just makes a little bit of a difference. It just brightens that area just a little bit. And then I'm going to use the clone stamp to go through and just check for any other areas that I can refine a little easier than I could with the healing brush. Mostly like some spots for color or any big areas that are sticking out. Wrinkles in the foreheads that can be softened, anything like that that was a little bit tricky with the healing brush. I'm sorry, I am not talking well today. I apologize for that. And again, you want to make sure that you have your layers set to current and below, or else it's just going to sample a blank layer and you're not going to see any differences. So I'm going to rename this group together the healing layer. Okay, so the next thing I like to do is dodging and burning. So this whole process is similar to a frequency separation. It's just a little bit more hands-on, so you can control it a little bit better. I made a mistake here and was not paying attention to my layer order. And for dodging and burning, you really need a flat layer. And I just wasn't thinking when I was doing this. So I'm going to show you another process after I do this. But I do create a black and white layer because it helps me to see the highlights and the shadows a little bit better. And the whole goal with the dodging and burning is we're going to smooth the transitions from the highlights to the shadows, just to create a little softer look. So you can see there's a shadow there. There is heavy shadow along the cheekbone, and then there's some highlights. And we don't want to get rid of those. We're just wanting to ease the transition so that they're a little bit more smooth. Make sure it's set to midtones. Up at the top, make sure you have your airbrush turned on so that you can build. And I have the exposure set down to 10%. Now, like I said, I should have created a new flat layer to be doing the dodging and burning on. So I'm going to delete these two layers here. And then I actually have an action from a class that I took by Pratik Nick from Sue Bryce, and it does the exact same thing. It just gives me a flattened area, and it already does the black and white for you. So on his, instead of doing a blank layer, he did curves levels for the dodge and burn, but it's literally the exact same thing. So if you want to do it manually, just make sure you have a flattened layer at the top. You can do a merge visible to do that. Anytime you do that, make sure you save a PSD file. So I'm moving that back up to the top, that way I can make sure I'm sampling everything below. And then I'm not going to keep the image black and white when I'm done. Like I said, I'm only using it to help me see the transition. So first, I'm going to start with showing what the dodge and burn does. So the burning makes things darker. And right now I've got my brush flow up at 28%. I'm really going to bring it down, but just so you can see what it does. And then the dodging makes things lighter. So you really want to make sure you're subtle with this, which is why keep it down at between 5 and 3%. If you have too much, it's going to be really obvious and you're going to end up with a harsh white line. You also want to make sure your brush is sized relative to whatever area you're using it in. So if you have a tiny area, you're going to want a smaller brush. If you have a larger area, you want a larger brush. So just wanting to show again, if you're not using the right size brush or the right flow, you're going to leave those harsh white lines there. You don't want that. So because that shadow is a little bit softer, I'm going to bring my flow down to 3% instead of 5%. So you can still see the shadows on the face. They're just not as harsh. They're going to blend into the midtones and the highlights a little bit softer. Okay, so now I'm going to work on the burn tool to do the same thing as I did in the shadows, but this time I'm focusing on the highlights. So there's a really bright highlight right there on the cheek that I want to be blended a little bit more than it is. So really it's going to be the T-zone usually that you need to use this in. There's places that are really not transition well because they're picking up highlights from your strobe light or from your natural light, whatever light source you're using. So I'm going to turn the black and white layer off, and then you can see the difference there. So I still have the shadows. They haven't gone away, they're just softer. So you're still keeping the depth. Maybe you feel like you went overboard, so if you do, then just bring your opacity down on the layer a little bit. Okay, and then over here on the arm, my elbow there is catching more of the highlights because it's closer to the light source. So I'm going to go in with a burn and just very softly lower that a little bit. Again, we don't want to get rid of all of the highlights and shadows because then your image is going to look really flat and fake. You can see that it's just going to work a little bit better. So next we're going to work on coloring. So if you have done some basic color corrections but you still feel like your skin tone is really uneven, you can do a gradient map. And again, Cindy has some basic skin tones actions that will do this for you. But if you want to do it yourself, what I'm doing is I'm creating a gradient map and I'm sampling the darkest shadows on the body. And then I'm going to create a mid-tone, the midpoint. And I'm going to find a mid-tone, generally on the face. And then I'm going to find a spot that has the brightest highlights on the face or on the body. I'm going to sample that. So all the colors are still, they're existing in the picture already, so I'm not changing anything drastically. And then I'm going to invert the mask, bring opacity up to around 30 or 40%, and then I'm going to brush it on. And all that's going to do is it's going to even out the skin tone for this. And I'm bumping the flow up on my brush so that it will build just a little bit more quickly. So you can see here what it's going to do. So it's really not changing the colors, it's just evening things out, and maybe there's still a little bit of gray or a tone in there that you don't really want. It will take care of that. Now the one thing I didn't do on this that I normally do and that you should definitely do is set your blend mode from normal and put it to color. Sometimes it's okay if you don't. In this case, there, changed it. Alright, so you definitely want to make sure that it's set to color or else it's going to wash out your image. Okay, and then here's another layer. Again, just pushing the color a little bit further. So maybe I feel like there are spots on the cheek that the strobe washed out the makeup or the blush, so I'm just going to touch that up a little bit. You can also use a color layer to fix any blotchiness in color that you see anywhere on the body as well that maybe didn't get picked up with the gradient map. So then I'm going to use one of Cindy's Extras actions. You can also do this with a curves layer. But I feel like the hair is a little bit too dark on this image, so I'm brightening the midtones, which will leave the shadows and highlights there. It's just going to bring the midtones up a little bit so the hair, you can see more definition in the hair. Okay, and then I'm going to combine all of these to a group, and I'm going to name it Clean Edit. And at this point I would normally save it as a PSD. My computer's been a little bit slow, so right here I'm just going to do a history snapshot. That way if I do something that I don't like, I can go back here and revert it. So you can see the difference there. It's still subtle, it still looks like the same person, it's just clean. And then I'm going to flatten the image. Normally I would not do that without saving a PSD. Okay, so now I'm going to do some color toning. You can do this with the hue and saturation layer or color balance layer or channel mixer. For this case I want to show you a plugin that I have. It's called Exposure or Alien Skin. And it's going to globally adjust your image, but then over on the right side there's that panel that you can change things. And so I'm just going to show you, if you choose to use this, some of the things you can do with it. Sometimes I really like it for my images and sometimes it doesn't do what I want at all, but I feel like sometimes they wash things out a little bit too much for me. And so I usually increase the vibrance and saturation. And then if you want to add a new layer, you can. And maybe try a different method. So what this does is it takes like old films and it makes your images have the same kind of look as a film photo. I stick with Color Films Vintage or Color Films Aged. And before you click on them, you can kind of preview what your image would look like. So in this case, maybe I'll decide that I liked some of the tones in this one, but I didn't like how washed out it made the image, so I'm going to bring the intensity down. And then sometimes I'll play around with cleaning, with making the shadows darker. If there's a border or grain on that you don't want, you can scroll down and you can just change any of those that you don't want. In this case, there's no green, so I don't have to turn anything off. Then you're going to hit apply, and it's just a filter on your photo. And then, like I said, you can do this. I've got this infinite color panel that will do it for you as well, and that one's a little bit more complicated. It can be as easy as just hitting create, but usually I don't like the global adjustment, so you'll have to go in and do a few more layers. Or usually what I do is a hue saturation adjustment, and then I play around with the channel mixer a little bit. So if you're interested in color grading, there are a lot of really great tutorials on YouTube, or you can just experiment with it. Okay, so the next thing I do on all of my images lately that I've been doing in studio is I go to a camera raw filter, and then I'm going to increase the clarity a little bit. You want to be careful with clarity, because if you go overboard with it, it's going to make, it doesn't matter if you have the most beautiful skin in the world, it's going to make it look really aged and harsh. So I like to keep it between 15 and 25. And then for this photo, I want it to still have some depth, so I'm increasing the contrast, and I bring the blacks up a little bit so the blacks are a little bit more defined. And I feel like this photo still has too much yellow in it, so I'm just adding some more blues in there to combat the yellows. And then, depending on the image, I usually bring the luminance up just a touch. And again, you want to be really careful with that, because I feel like if you go overboard with the luminance, it can make everything look really plasticky and fake. So then you can see the difference there. It's really subtle, but I feel like it just gives a little bit more depth. And then again, at this stage, I would save my file as a PSD, since I'm going to flatten it. And then I'm going to duplicate the background layer, and this is something I do on all of my images. Then I go and I do some dodging and burning. And I look for the highlights, especially like in the hair or in folds of fabric. And especially in the iris too, I like to brighten up the catch lights. So make sure your brush is small. On this one my brush was small, but I have the cursor set a little bit bigger just so you can see where I'm working. So I brighten the eyes, and then it really gives your hair a nice bit of depth and makes hair look healthy and shiny when you increase the highlights on the hair just a little bit, and later I'll go in with a burn tool and deepen the shadows. So I'm just looking for places where highlights are hitting on the image. The dress, normally I would add some, but since this dress already has a lot of shine on it, the strobe was hitting the dress anyway, so I'm going to go down to the fabric at the bottom where there isn't shine. And in all of those gathers, I'm just going to increase where the highlight is and just lightly brush over it. Again, my flow is down at 10%, so really, really subtle. You can always build. And then I'm going to switch over to a burn tool. And now I'm going to go add some depth with the shadows. So here, I like to outline the iris just a little bit. And then in this case, the makeup was supposed to be really dramatic, but the strobe washed some of it out, so I'm brushing it over the makeup just a little bit more. I'm outlining the iris where we usually have that little bit of dark on the outside of our eyes. I also usually clean up the eyebrows just a little bit if they need it. I'm going into the hair, and where it's darker on the hair, especially where there are curls, I'm deepening the shadows on that. And then I'm going to darken the lips a little bit because the lipstick in person was darker. Now I want to show you how you need to be really careful with the burn tool and with the highlight, but especially with the burn. If you go overboard and you're not doing things evenly, you're going to make things look blotchy and super dark. So I just hit Command Z or Control Z. And I'm just lightly brushing over it. Then I like to usually just brush a tiny bit under the chin to create some definition there, some separation from the neck to the jawline. Again, be very careful. Then just touching up little tiny details on the eyes again. Check for things like eyelashes. And then down here dealing with the folds. Like I mentioned earlier, when I'm doing the clean stage at the very beginning, I would have dealt with the imperfections in the fabric here. You can see some creases. But for the purposes of this video, I didn't mess with it. Okay, and then I'm switching back to the dodge tool. I like to work the image as a whole, so I usually switch back and forth. But anytime there's jewelry, especially like rings or diamonds, I like to add just a very slight touch of dodging to highlight a little bit. And then here I feel like the dress was so shiny that it was catching a lot of the highlight and distracting. So if you use your Alt key, it'll actually turn your highlight brush back into a dodge using the same settings, and if you just hold it down, you can clean things up there. So I burned those highlights a little bit. You can see that. Okay, so now I'm going to snapshot and then just show you a before and after. Before and after. Thanks for watching.